also say before we begin this conversation, this episode, that I do have a lot of empathy for Gypsy Rose. I do believe that she was horrendously victimized by her mother. I believe that she went through was indescribably painful and unnecessary. And I believe that that the medical system did fail her, that every system failed her, and that this should have been and could have been caught so much earlier, that so many people could have prevented this. So I have a tremendous amount of empathy for what she went through. There's no question in my mind that Gypsy Rose is a victim and she was abused. And I just want to set that straight before we begin this conversation, because we're going to go down some paths here that might be a little controversial. I want to start by, now that I mentioned the victim part, I do think that in analyzing this case, I think it's important to consider two facets of this case. That there's the case of Gypsy as a victim of abuse, and then there's Gypsy as a murderer. And I think those are very different parts of this analysis, and they're important parts to consider. I think that Gypsy, the murderer, is quite different than Gypsy, the victim of abuse. So I will be separating those two parts of this analysis. But let's start with, there is a video from 2009, I believe, of Gypsy singing at an event for a cancer. Is it the American Cancer Society? Okay.
The American Cancer Society. Yes.
Okay. So if you could go ahead and please play that.
All right, here you go. There you go.
Okay, right. So for those of you who have watched Gypsy's prison confessions, and Lauren and I haven't watched all of it, by the way, because the last two episodes are airing tonight. In fact, they're airing during the show. So we haven't seen all of it. So in that sense, we might be a little behind, but we have watched the documentaries, including the HBO documentary. We've looked at the interrogation videos. We've looked at just about everything we can, and we've watched the recent prison confessions. So that's where we're getting our information, in addition to some articles and some discussions and some groups. But we've looked at a wide array of sources. So I want to say that those are our sources tonight. The question, so Gypsy Rose raises a really important question early on. And that question is, she sees it as the most important question. It's a question she gets over and over again. And that question is, and I'm going to quote her here, this is from the prison confessions. She says, people ask her, quote, "Why didn't you just stand up?" And that's how she puts it. So, it's interesting that she doesn't say that the question is, why didn't you just stand up to your mother? She says, why didn't you just stand up? And there's a sense in which, ironically or interestingly enough, I think she's talking about two senses of standing up. One is standing up literally. In other words, getting out of her wheelchair and standing up and showing the world that she can stand. And by the way, Gypsy knows that she can stand. She knows this from a very early age. In fact, the reason she took to a wheelchair was because she was in a motorcycle accident with her grandfather, Claude, when she was 5 years old, and she scraped her leg. It was a fairly minor accident for her, but she scraped her leg, and then her mother saw that scrape. So her mother, DIDNT, saw the scraped leg, and she used that to put Gypsy in a wheelchair. And from that moment forward, Gypsy never left the wheelchair. even though the family would see her bouncing on a trampoline, and the family would see her later when Dee Dee had an accident and Gypsy was around age